moved back to OC. I think it's been like a couple, like 2 or 3 months now.
Okay.
All right, we're live now.
Perfect.
All right, so we're on live on Zoom. So let's go ahead and get started because we have a few people that have started logging on. Thank you both Prema and Hans for joining us. Welcome everyone to the Shia Muslim Council U.S. Elections and Ballot Measures discussion, as well as with MPAC and Hans Johnson here. My name is Mehdi Hirji. I'm one of the Board of Trustees for the Shia Muslim Council, and we have a short but informative session here today. And so let me just start off by sharing my screen, and we can get into our presentation here today. So hopefully my screen is coming through here.
Perfect. I see it.
All right. So we'll start here with some introductions, so you get to know a little bit about our speakers, and then we'll go into these topics here of what is the role of the Islamic Center during elections that Prema will cover. And then Hans will cover what can the Islamic Center do during elections, and then Prema will continue on with recommendations on ballot measures. So let me introduce Prema first. Prema Rahman first joined MPAC as a policy intern in 2017. After she volunteered in the 2016 convention featuring Van Jones. From there, she went on to become a Special Projects Fellow. She now works as MPAC's Human Security Program Manager, organizing community programs, building government relations, and advocating civic engagement for the Muslim American community. She has been instrumental in working with SMC on interfaith issues, including the Expressions of Unity program. So Prema, thank you again for making time to join us and educate our community. Our second guest speaker is Hans Johnson. Hans leads a not-for-profit advocacy program at the local, state, and national level. He directs the foremost national hotline for troubleshooting for frontline advocates of 501c3 and C4 organizations in the country through Roadmap Consulting. So Hans, we have a number of people that will be joining us online today that are members of their Islamic Institute's board of directors. So they're really looking for your feedback here. Hans has been doing this for 45 years. He has integrated community-based and national supported campaigns, working closely with a number of organizations, including foundations, clergy, and interfaith organizations. His commentary appears on Huffington Post and daily op-eds pages around California and throughout the nation. So Hans, again, thank you for joining on short notice here, and I'm hopeful that our community will find a lot of benefit in our discussion here today. So our first topic is the role of the Islamic Center during elections. So Prema, can you comment on this, please?
Yes, you got it. First of all, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you, Mehdi and Shia Muslim Council for inviting us over for this crucial webinar. We're only a couple weeks away from elections right now. So the content that we'll be going over today is absolutely necessary. And I hope those of you who have joined us have your ballot measures ready, have your ballots ready to fill out and ready to go. I know from my end, like the first thing I'm going to do after this is go on, tick off like all the boxes I need to, and then drop it off at an official ballot box. So with that said, I want to briefly cover the role of elections and our civic duty in Islam, and then also what Islamic centers can be doing at this time to encourage voting, before I go into later what the ballot measures specifically are. So civic engagement and duties in Islam is actually something that is mandated to us by Allah. You'll see that this is something that comes up like Allah's mandate to us to uphold good deeds or to do good deeds, to get to know one another, to engage with one another. These themes and principles appear multiple times throughout the Quran. So you have Surah Al-Hujurat, which is 49, verse 13, where God says, "O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may get to know one another." So that's God directly telling us, Allah directly telling us that we must get to know one another. We need to engage with one another to understand where we're coming from and to ultimately work together despite our differences to uphold justice and what's right. So we have an obligation to participate in civic engagement to ensure that our voices as American Muslims are heard and that our interests are, advanced and preserved, instead of simply relying on others to kind of make those decisions for us. Voting is an absolutely essential exercise of our right and our civic duty to not only choose the leaders who will represent us and impact our daily lives, but also to improve the conditions and the rights for all people, which again is something that's mandated to us through the Quran over and over again. Just another example of that you can find in Surah Al-Ma'idah 5, which is Surah 5, verse 8, where God says, "O believers, stand firm for Allah and bear true testimony. Do not let the hatred of a people lead you to injustice. Be just, that is closer to righteousness, and be mindful of Allah. Surely Allah is all aware of what you do." So when we're consistently told to uphold justice and to do what's right, one of the key ways to doing that right now, today, is to make sure that we're voting for the right people to represent us in office, and we're voting for the right ballot measures to be passed. In terms of political duty, this is something I don't have this directly on the slide right now, but the Medina Constitution is a perfect example of how we've been interacting as American, or not as American Muslims, but as Muslims historically with politics, how we've being Muslim goes hand in hand with also our political being, of our civic engagement, of our duty to have a say in who gets elected or have a say in who is ultimately making those legislation or those decisions for us at a higher political level. So with that said, and I don't want to take up too much time on this one, but what can Islamic centers do? I know that Hans, you'll be going into specifically the cans and cannots, but from my end, I'll just say that, from our Islamic Center side, what we can do is educate our communities on the right information. We know that there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are unfortunately a lot of, different kinds of fake websites or fake information going out, fake news going out. What we want to do is we want to ensure that our community members have the right information, that they know where to cast their ballot, they know, to keep an eye out for getting their ballots in the mail, how to fill it out, where to drop it off, whether or not they're registered properly. These are all information that our Islamic centers can be critical in dispersing accurately. We should also, play an active role in making sure our community is informed about how voting and civic engagement is in fact a part of Islam, and that we kind of break down all the misunderstanding or or misinformation about folks saying, oh, it's not Islamic to vote, which in fact is not true. The next recommendation I have, and I this is free for adoption, if you guys feel that it's viable, is you can lead a khutbah prior to the elections, going over the history of the Medina Constitution, the history of how our Prophet, peace be upon him, was not only a religious leader, but he also had a separate of his religious role, he had a political role, and going into the history of voting, or the history of determining who leads us, that's all outlined in our own Islamic history. So I think that will help our community members understand the importance of voting. And with that, I'll let Hans take it over.
Great, yeah, Hans, if you can tell us, what can Islamic centers do and should not do during this period of time, especially with us just being a couple weeks away from elections?
Or with elections ongoing now, and in many cases, in many cities, more than half of voters already having voted. In some parts of Virginia, we're seeing already voting levels at 70 and even 80%, which is absolutely astounding, but also laudable given the efforts to improve early voting and voting by mail, especially in this COVID era general election. I'm Hans Johnson. I'm president of Progressive Victory. I'm a longtime advisor to MGAGE at the national level and to various Muslim American organizations over the last 5 years. I'm very pleased that Mehdi and Prema have invited me and honored me with the opportunity to provide whatever guidance and technical assistance I can today here, as we are in the midst of perhaps the most important presidential election of all of our lifetimes. I'm also pleased to have people far older than I. I think many might have slightly overstated my involvement in the field. It's 25 years, not necessarily 45 years, but there are people who've been involved for 75 years who are saying themselves that this is the most important election of their lifetimes. And I think we all know and can take to heart many of the nightmares, the anguish, the anxiety, and the pain, but also the solidarity, the kinship, and the new coalition bonds that have been forged through the struggles and the heartache of the past 4 years particularly. So in that context, it is a particular honor and a particular joy to be able to share some do's and don'ts with you today about effective advocacy and get out the vote activities and messaging that can be conducted by Islamic centers like any other religious charity in the country. To start off, and I want to just preface this by saying I will provide some written guidance after this presentation that can be shared through the conveners, and I welcome all of you to receive that, and if it is not immediately forthcoming, to ask the conveners for that, who will have this one-page written guidance summarizing my comments here today in written form later on today. And I will be providing a hotline, a free hotline that you can call with questions about technical assistance or troubleshooting, the very same questions of do's and don'ts being discussed here today at the end of my remarks. In short, there are 3 simple do's and 2 simple don'ts for charities, religious charities, churches, and Islamic centers around elections. The 3 important do's are that you can talk about issues. You can discuss policy issues. You can discuss legislation. You can discuss regulation that has been handed down from a government official or from government bodies. You can talk about the unconscionable and inhumane Muslim travel ban that has been a fixture of the nightmare of these past 4 years. That is an acceptable policy issue to discuss in moral terms through Islamic centers, by leaders of Islamic centers, and by special guests speaking about the impact of such policies as the Muslim travel ban on your congregation, on your communities, or on the people in your families and in the communities that you serve. That is a legitimate issue discussion to be had, especially in connection with review of the past 4 years. You should not, however, prefacing one of the don'ts, attach an issue discussion with the command to vote. So it is great to discuss issues. It is wonderful to discuss the ramifications and the impact, however personal, however political, however economic, and broader, of policy issues. But you should refrain from attaching the issue discussion to the command or the instruction to vote. Just as you can talk about issues, you can talk about ballot measures. Ballot measures are issues. Ballot measures are policy issues, which are fair game for any charity to discuss. So ballot measures, like any public policy issue, can be discussed safely within the bounds of your 501c3 status as a religious organization, as a charity, by an Islamic center. So know that for generations, religious right institutions, those that have often preached against recognition of our religious pluralism and our religious diversity have long used ballot measure discussions as a means for revving up the political content and the participation of their congregations. And other charities, other religious institutions, including Islamic centers, can do no less. So recognize that if there is a policy issue that is of particular relevance to your congregation or to a mosque or Islamic center at the local level, do understand that policy issues, which include ballot measures, are fair game for rich discussion, including during worship services or thereafter. And finally, the third do that you can do is discussing how to vote and discussing the methods of voting. To discuss the importance here in California, for instance, of dropping off your ballot into the mail, especially as early as you can, or dropping it off in an official ballot box, not one of the fraudulent, bogus ballot boxes being put out by one particular political party as a stunt throughout California. The propriety of the process of voting, how to vote, not necessarily whom to vote for, but how to vote is a legitimate do for an Islamic center and any other charity. But again, try to refrain from attaching the policy discussion or the ballot measure from the command or urging to vote, because that linkage between a policy stance and voting or how to vote is safe for a C4 organization. It is not charitable activity. And that is one area where if you have people closely scrutinizing your activities, or where you want to be sure that you are staying on the safe side of charitable advocacy, just try to refrain from linking the policy discussion or ballot measure to the command to vote. It's fine to discuss that separately, but you should try to refrain from making the linkage there. Now let's talk about the don'ts. And these tend to be more deeply ingrained. People tend to have stronger instincts about this, but let's reaffirm those instincts with knowledge. The two don'ts to avoid: one, we've already covered, linking the commandment or the urging to vote with a policy discussion. You can also register people to vote in a similar vein, but you cannot link the registration to vote. We are still here 2 days away from the voter registration deadline in California and in several other states. So I do want to make sure we touch on the opportunity to register people at Islamic centers. That is appropriate. That is an appropriate activity, so long as you do not attach that registration to any partisan stance or any particular policy stance. Again, making that linkage is a C4 activity, a 501c4 activity. It is not a charitable activity. So you can discuss the policy issues, you can register people to vote, you just can't screen it based on those policy stances or partisan leanings or any partisan motives. And the second don't, tends to be very deeply inculcated already, more widely known. Again, we tend to have very good instincts and awareness and antenna about this issue, but you cannot make a recommendation for a partisan stand or for a candidate. Under the tax code, under the rules for charities, taking a partisan stand or being partisan in messaging does not mean Democrat or Republican, Green, Independent, or otherwise. Taking a partisan stand means favoring or opposing one candidate or another, even if those candidates are for nonpartisan offices. So be aware that the word partisanship, and to avoid partisanship, does not simply mean refraining from leaning or explicitly favoring one party or another, but to avoid advocating the endorsement or opposition to any candidate for office, whether nonpartisan or not, or candidates or slate of candidates. Again, be they nonpartisan, partisan, or a mixture thereof. Those are the two don'ts, in addition to the three do's. So I wanted to be very clear about that, and also that will be reflected in the follow-up guidance provided. I do welcome questions both in the chat and as time might permit today, but I do want to be sure to share with you the hotline tips for tips that I offered. Again, tips is the word to remember. The email address for sharing any question that you might have about allowable charitable advocacy by your Islamic Center or by the leaders of your Islamic Center, or the people you might invite to speak at your Islamic Center for a khutbah of the type that Prema mentioned, or in any other activity that you might sponsor. The email address is tips@roadmapconsulting.org. Again, that's tips@roadmapconsulting.org. And there is a phone number, which I will also share in the chat, 224-818-6468. Again, 224-818-6468. We will answer your questions in short order as soon as possible and provide you any relevant, hands-on practical guidance that we can to address the question that you have. Thank you very much for being able to provide this, and I look forward to providing any follow-up guidance that may be necessary.
Hans, thank you for that. This is great information, and we look forward to getting the written information, because we do have, as I mentioned, we do have Islamic Center leaders online, and so we do want to provide that information to them, and we'll also pass along the hotline number as well as the email address. One of the things that you mentioned, we're taking questions live on YouTube for those that want to submit questions, and I'll read them off accordingly, is one of our good friends here, Aslam Dada from the Islamic Center of Yorba Linda, just reminded us, and you also mentioned it, that let's make sure that we're dropping off our ballots to the right government ballot box, the official ones, not the ones that have been unofficially set up. So make sure that you're looking it up at your voter registration county website. Where are those ballot boxes, and drop them off. We're going to move to our third portion of our webinar here, which Prema is going to take back and walk through the ballot measures that we have. As Hans mentioned, we won't, as Han mentioned, as a 5-3, we will not be going through the candidates, but we will be going over the ballot measures. So pull out your ballots right now. Let's do them together. Obviously, these are recommendations. You can choose whatever you'd like to do, and hopefully all of you will be able to get your ballots completed today if you've not been able to do so already, and proudly wear the I voted sticker that came with your ballot. So Prem, I'm going to hand it over to you, and just tell me when you're ready to move forward with each of the ballot measures.
You got it. Thank you so much. And yes, absolutely. If you don't have it already, please take out your ballot so you can, as we're going through this, and again, this is merely a recommendation from our end on what we think what we recommend voting, how we recommend voting on those particular ballot measures. But ultimately, the reason why we're doing this in the first place is to make sure that you have all the information that you need to make an informed decision on how to vote. So with that said, I'll begin with Prop 14. So Prop 14 is essentially what it would like to do is it would be a follow-up to a 2004 Prop 71 that we had approved, which was originally intended to kickstart our state's California stem cell research, and it ultimately created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, CIRM. And essentially, what this particular proposition would do is it would pump in an additional $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds to fund CIRM. What this would do is it would kind of increase the burden on Californian taxpayers, especially during our economic downturn at this point in time, especially due to the pandemic. And one of the key critiques about this particular proposition is that it does not address CIRM's, like the critiques aimed at CIRM about the lack of transparency, or whether or not, the research that is produced or the results that are produced through this research will in fact benefit public. Rather, what would happen is, as it stands, what would happen is any kind of research that comes about through the stem cell research done here, or any kind of breakthroughs that are done, ultimately, even when they're used for like public health, the public themselves would be charged at a pretty high price for them. And then from there, there's also been other critique that, over the years, the funding that they received from Prop 71, which was about $3 billion back in 2004, of which CIRM has merely $132 million remaining, that there hasn't been any kind of significant progress or advancements made through this particular research. So although, we acknowledge the benefits of like stem cell research, particularly when it comes to issues of like bone marrow transplants or looking into treatments for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, what we're looking for in this proposition, or what we understand through our research here, is that it's not addressing a lot of like the lackings of CIRM. And in this economy in particular, we just do not think it's a good idea to increase the burden on taxpayers at this point in time. Another quick note that I want to make on this particular proposition is the Islamic perspective on stem cell research. So because stem cell research, it does oftentimes use, more often than not, in fact, use embryonic stem cell. There is this is particularly, oh, I see a question from Salam Al-Huri. Yes, absolutely, we can share the slides with you, inshallah. When it comes to stem cell research, and as with many of the major religions out there, there is contention, there's debate, there's no actual singular authority on the use of stem cell research in Islam. So what happens is the embryos being used in this kind of research, they come from eggs that were fertilized in vitro fertilization clinics, but never implanted in the uterus, which are then donated with the consent of the donors. So what I would recommend is, with this proposition, do your diligent research and understand where you stand on stem cell research. There is, again, no particular singular authority from the Islamic perspective on where we stand with stem cell research, because what we're facing is, on one end, respect for human life, and on the other end, protecting and preserving human life. So with that, I'll go into the next proposition, Proposition 15. So Proposition 15, for this particular one, we're not actually providing any recommendation at this point in time. This is something where we're going to be presenting you with the pros and cons, and then ultimately you will make that decision based on what you're seeing from the pros and cons list as to how you think this would be impacting you and what you think would be the most just for a proposition like this. So what Prop 15 would do is it would tax commercial and industrial properties, exempting business owners with less than $3 million in holdings in accordance with their present property values, rather than what the property values were at the time of purchase. And right now, what we've seen is, over the years, like the property value increases, but what ends up happening is those who purchased that property, like the commercial property or industrial property, say back in 1999, when the tax rate, or when the tax on that particular amount was much lower, they're continuing to pay the same amount. So what this would do is it would adjust that to the present property values. The collected amounts from that would be 40% going to schools, 60% to local governments. However, this is up to each city and county to allocate. So even if Prop 15 does pass, what we need to make sure as as civically engaged communities is, if the proposition passes, we need to continue engaging with each city and county to make sure that those amounts are allocated properly, to our schools. So we need to engage with those representatives. Let's see. Oh, a little background on this proposition as well. It seeks to close a loophole in Proposition 13 of 1978 to ensure that companies pay their fair amount of property taxes based on today's rate rather than the rates of 1978. Perfect. And then So a pro argument on this, one other that I don't have on the slide, is that $3 million threshold for this would mean that it has less of an impact on small businesses and more so are geared toward larger businesses, for example, like Walmart. Now on to the cons for Prop 15. So the next slide. So from the con side, one of the key critiques for this one is that it selectively applies tax hike to certain commercial properties, exempting residential properties. So what this would do actually is, and what the opponents of this proposition are saying is that it would in fact actually still impact small business owners who are already hurting as a result of, like I said before, like of the economic downturn induced by the pandemic, which, as we've been seeing in California in particular, has caused an immense number of business closures. And then it's also caused capital flight from California because of already hostile situations or hostile conditions for small businesses. Also, another key point here in like the language and body of the proposition is that there are open questions about the reallocation procedures. The tax revenue that we get from this proposition would first be distributed to the state and counties to supplement decreases in revenue due to increased tax deductions under our current administration to cover the costs of implementing the measure. Then the remainder of that, from that, would be 40% to schools and 60% to local governments. So with that, I'll move on to Proposition 16. So our recommendation for Proposition 16 is to vote yes, to repeal the 209 Affirmative Action Amendment of 1996. Now, 209 Affirmative Action Amendment, as a name, as a title, is very much misleading, and it can easily make a voter think, oh, it's trying to repeal something that's pro-affirmative action. No, that's not the case at all. Rather, what 209 Affirmative Action Amendment of 1996 did was it banned affirmative action on the basis that it granted, quote unquote, preferential treatment, which they saw as racial discrimination. In reality, we know that's not the case. Affirmative action, what it tries to do is it tries to level the playing field. It tries to give even opportunities, which, but due to racial discrimination, what we see is, like, despite folks coming with the same qualifications, they'll inevitably, if they are not getting the equal amount of opportunities, or if they're facing employers or college boards who do have racial leanings, then they're discriminated against. So because we as a community are invested in American pluralist future, we suggest voting yes to repeal the amendment of 1996 to make sure that we're alleviating those obstacles. And then, like I said before, we will be sharing the slides as well, so you have like this information in front of you when you're filling out your ballot, so you can look into more information as well here. Next up, we have Prop 17. So our recommendation for Prop 17 is to vote yes to the voting rights restoration for persons on parole amendment. This would allow folks who have served their time in prison to reintegrate back into society. And it's particularly in California, it's beneficial to those who suffered under the unjust 3 strikes and you're out law, which unfortunately, it sent many people into prison for petty crimes. And what it did is not only feed our prison pipeline system, but it also inhibited those people from pursuing more enriched lives or giving them an opportunity to better their ways. So now, nearly 50,000 Californians would be impacted by this proposition. If we vote yes, then they can actually get the chance to reintegrate back into regular life, and they'll get that chance to vote and be able to become contributing members to society. So our recommendation for this one is to vote yes. The next one we have is Prop 18. Mehdi, if you could just go on to the next slide.
I did. It's probably just a load time delay. Hopefully you can see it.
Oh, yes, perfect. Yes, I can now. Just give me 1 second. All right, perfect. So Prop 18 is a pretty straightforward proposition. What it wants to do is it wants to allow 17-year-olds who are currently 17 at the time of primary elections and who will be 18 at the time of general elections to be able to vote in the primary elections. This is something that we are seeing in multiple states. So currently to date, there are 18 other states who are doing so. So who are allowing 17-year-olds to vote in primaries if they are going to be 18 by the time of general elections. DC is included in that list as well. Our argument here is that being able to vote in the primary and special elections will help young voters to be exposed to and therefore be better educated about the election process and the candidates. And if they are to vote in general elections by the time they're 18, they ought to have a say in whose name appears on the ballot. So like I said, this one's a pretty straight cut one. So our recommendation here is a yes. Up next, we have Prop 19. So this would allow for older homeowners to maintain their property tax assessments, which is another way of saying their tax breaks that they've been enjoying, and they would be able to transfer that when they're moving to a newer and more expensive home. As like I said before, in reviewing previous ballots, prices have, skyrocketed, or values of properties have skyrocketed. And so what this would allow is for older homeowners to kind of take their smaller tax payments or those tax breaks and transfer it to a more expensive property value. It would also increase the number of times that persons aged 55 and over or with severe disabilities can transfer those tax assessments to one property value, from one property to like 3 properties. So what we recommend for this one in particular is voting no, because as we see it, this would only allow those who've already been privileged or those who are already enjoying a certain level of wealth status to just keep that circle and just increase their wealth without really just redistributing wealth equitably. So to keep our widening wealth gap in check, we recommend voting no on this one. Up next, we have Prop 20. So this one is also related to one of the previous propositions I spoke about in terms of restoring voting rights and like how not doing so would only go on to feed our prison pipeline system. So Prop 20, what it proposes to do is it proposes to categorize certain kinds of petty theft or fraudulent crimes like credit card fraud or vehicle theft as misdemeanors or felonies rather than simply misdemeanors. And what this would do is it would add those crimes to the list of violent felonies for which early parole is restricted. As we know, California already faces some of the largest issues of overcrowding in our prison system, if not the largest in the nation. And what it would do is it's merely another vehicle for feeding the prison pipeline system, especially for petty crimes. And what it would do is it would hold back those who have been committing such crimes from rehabilitating or from actually trying to build better behavior. Instead, just putting them behind bars without any kind of chance at improvement. So our recommendation for this one is to vote no. Up next, we have Proposition 21. This one is very much salient to what we've been seeing happening during the pandemic. Earlier this year, we saw that we were in the midst of a massive housing crisis where because of the economic downturn due to the pandemic, many folks were either getting laid off their jobs or their stipends or incomes were being slashed. And as a result, they were having a hard time making their rental payments. And what we saw was a massive rise in tension between landlords and like the ability of tenants to be able to pay their rent. And I know that in cities like, or counties like LA, there were measures put in place to kind of act as a safety net to ensure people were in their homes. So for this particular proposition, what it would do is it would allow rent control on housing first occupied over 15 years ago, with the exception of landlords who own two homes, who own maximum two homes with separate titles. So it's two homes or less. And what it would do is it would modify the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act and give more rights to renters. So it would essentially help us keep Californians in their home. It would provide further protections for renters who are at risk of being, evicted by their landlords. And again, especially during the time of the pandemic, this is more important than ever. So our recommendation for this one is to vote yes. Up next, and I'll briefly pause. I know that there are many propositions and measures that I'm going through, and this is something, for the sake of time, I'm trying to keep as short as possible. But after this, inshallah, like Matthew and I will coordinate to make sure that you have direct access to whatever you're seeing on these slides. So you can take some more time to let it sit with you before you cast your ballot. So up next, we have Proposition 22. This is very much, I'm sure if you guys have seen TV or if you guys have been on Instagram anytime over the last couple of weeks, I'm sure you guys have been seeing a myriad of different advertisements on this particular proposition. It's probably one of the most heavily covered propositions in our current ballot cycle. So what this would do is it would keep app-based drivers like Uber drivers, Lyft drivers as independent contractors rather than employees, therefore withholding them from certain benefit packages and bargaining power. For this one, we know that we've been seeing, and there have been multiple articles about this, about how the different corporations like Uber and Lyft have been pouring immense amounts of money into advertisements to vote yes on this proposition to protect their own interests. And what we're seeing on the other side is labor groups who are actively organizing to urge us to vote no, because what this proposition would do is it would restrict the labor rights of app-based drivers. If they're kept as independent contractors rather than full-blown employees, there are certain safety measures, employment safety measures in place that independent contractors would not be enjoying. So what instead they would get is poor benefits and negative impacts. According to Economic Policy Institute, for example, pre-COVID, Uber driver hourly compensation averaged about $11.77, which was far less than the $14.99 average hourly compensation of workers in the lowest paid major occupation. And part-time workers in the gig economy, when they applied for unemployment during like the beginning of the year at the onset of the pandemic, what they saw was they were entitled to $0 simply because they were classified as independent contractors. So as such, looking at these results, we strongly recommend voting no on this to preserve the rights and to preserve justice for app-based drivers. Up next, we have, sorry, what?
Sorry, I moved back a little bit too fast.
Oh, no, you're completely fine. You're completely fine. So Prop 23, that's another one that we've been hearing a lot about. I know that every time I turn on my TV, I see like at least like within the span of an hour, I'll see at least like 2-3 different advertisements for this one. So what this would do is it would essentially increase the number of requirements in place for the functioning or the operations of dialysis clinics, so kidney dialysis clinics. So it would, for example, require having at least one physician on site during all treatments. And there are at least like 3 or 4 other further requirements. So that would include like reporting data on dialysis related infections, require a principal officer of the clinic to certify that they are satisfied after review that the submitted report is accurate and complete, provide a written notice to the state health department to obtain consent from state health department before closing a chronic dialysis clinic. So what it does is it increases the burden on dialysis clinics. It increases the cost on dialysis clinics by several hundreds of thousands of dollars per year per clinic. This would overburden our already like existing shortage of physicians, and it would, as I said, impose increased costs on clinics. There's also little evidence about whether or not this measure would in fact help like preserve the health of the patients. And furthermore, because of the burdens placed on the clinics, this would also put pressure on the clinics to ultimately close down. So in the long term, what we're seeing is a yes on this proposition would not really produce any kind of tangible benefits for dialysis patients or dialysis clinics. So as such, until we have a stronger ballot measure in place for the next election cycle, we are suggesting a no on this one. Then we have Prop 24, which is to increase consumer protections for personal data privacy. This one, at least from my end, and I'm not even speaking from MPAC for this one, I'm very, very wary of sharing information online or having my information shared without my consent. I'm constantly on websites clicking no for the use of cookies. So for this one, what this would do is it would increase privacy protections for Californians. So it would prevent corporations and businesses like Facebook and Google from like mining your personal data, including exploiting sensitive information like your race or your geolocation or what your identity is. So to protect our privacy, to protect our personal data, all of that, we suggest voting a yes on this one. Okay, next up we have Proposition 25, which is to keep in place the use of cash bail for detained suspects awaiting trials. The alternative, so a yes on this proposition would be a risk-based assessment mechanism, which would essentially lead to further discrimination in criminal release proceedings. So what a no vote for this one, and this again is one of the ones that it's a little more complicated on like just from like the face value of this proposition. But what it would do is it would voting no would repeal a 2018 law that promoted pre-trial reform, but in reality, it exchanged money bail for a system that uses racially biased risk assessment tools and gives judges nearly unlimited discretion to incarcerate individuals and increases funding and power for law enforcement. So to make sure that we're not upholding any kind of like unjust like legal system, or that we're not allowing for judges to freely exercise any kind of racial bias or discrimination in determining the incarceration for those who are awaiting trials, we are saying vote no to make sure to protect the cash bail system, which already, to be honest, is an unfair system to begin with. But what the alternative being proposed in Prop 25 is far worse by allowing judges that unlimited or that unlimited or unharnessed power to use their discretion. So again, this one, I realize like the language on this one is a little more complicated. So keep an eye out for when we send you out this presentation to go over like the specifics for this. And I'll actually keep my notes in there as well, so you can like refer to the notes and the research that I have up there. Next up, we finally have is County Measure J. So for Measure J, our recommendation is to vote yes to direct 10% of locally controlled revenues, which is about $1 billion, from punitive approaches to community-based alternatives. So it would amend the LA County Charter to require at least 10% of locally controlled revenue to be invested into local communities as an alternative to incarceration. It's to fund what we've been saying, at least from the MPAC side, we've been calling for law enforcement reform and calling for more community-based approaches and alternatives, which up until now have not been receiving proper funding to even function in the first place. So what this would do is it would help nudge us in the right direction toward law enforcement reform and actually allow those communities or community-based initiatives like counseling, mental health services, youth development, small businesses, affordable housing to thrive from the revenue that they would be getting, which again is about $1 billion. And with that, that's the end of my portion. Mehdi, I'll pass it back to you. And if you guys have any questions at the end of this, please feel free to ask, text in the chat box or ask us toward the end.
Yep, so we're getting closer to finishing off our session here. Thanks for that, all those recommendations and insight into that. Really helpful. I tagged along and I did my ballot, so I'm ready to go and mail it out. So I've already gone ahead and put I voted sticker on myself. But just real quick on this last measure, this is for LA County only, correct?
Correct. This is for LA County only.
Okay, perfect. So for everyone that's on the call or on YouTube listening, this would only appear if you are within the LA County district.
Yeah.
At this point in time, go ahead.
Either. I said I wouldn't be seeing that one either. I'm in Orange County right now.
I'm going to poll everyone for if there's any questions. We have a few minutes left, both on the chats on YouTube and on Zoom. But as we're getting any questions from people, I just want to make people aware of our next big event that we have coming up on October 22nd at 6 p.m. Again, with the support and leading effort of the Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Islamic Center of Southern California. We're going to do a session on dismantling anti-Shiism. This is not a program just for the Shia community. This is a program for all communities. As we know, there's been a systematic anti-Shiism movement in recent weeks, especially abroad, and we want to make sure that people have an understanding of what this behavior is, and it's not an Islamic behavior. And so this will be a good educational program. As you can see, our speakers are young researchers and thought leaders in their respective part of the world. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. It doesn't look like we have any questions at this point in time. So I'm going to thank both you, Prema and Hans, for joining us today, spending your Saturday morning educating the community. And I know we have some materials that we'll be handing out to everyone through email related to today's presentation, as well as some of the do's and don'ts for the Islamic Center. I just want to remind not just the voters out there, but also our Islamic Center leaders that the last day to register to vote in the state of California is on Monday, the 19th. So it's very important that we communicate to our community to remind them that voting deadline is approaching here on the 19th. So please go ahead and submit. We will send out an email on how to do that. Each county has their own voter registration office, so we'll give you a listing of that so you can get registered to vote. Or you can go onto our Facebook and Instagram sites, and we've shared MPAC's guide on voting and how to get registered. So please do that. So with that, since there's no more questions, we will go ahead and end our session for today. Prema and Hans, any last words before we end?
Just to answer the question that just came up, in-person early voting throughout California begins on the 24th of October. Several additional vote centers open with 5 days before election. So that is on the 30th of October. So early voting is underway in voting by mail and at your local elections offices, but the vote centers in parts of Los Angeles County and elsewhere open on October 24th. Mail your ballot in, look for the secure drop boxes, make your voice heard.
Perfect. And just a reminder on the ballot boxes, please make sure you're dropping it off on an official county ballot box. And the best way to know which one is the right one, go to your county voter registration office website, find where those boxes are and drop it off over there. And yes, this webinar is going to be available on SMC TV on YouTube, as well as we'll be sending it out to our mailing list so everyone can benefit. Again, Hans and Prema, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for those that were able to join us, and happy voting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum.